Dearest listeners, there exists a peculiar cruelty in the drawing rooms of polite society, the tendency to mistake survival for fortune and silence for acceptance. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of a Scottish rose transplanted into English soil, where she was pitied rather than cherished, tolerated rather than embraced. But let us not rush to judgment of those who failed to see her worth, for the best stories, like the finest Madeira, must be savored properly. And this particular vintage carries notes both bitter and achingly sweet. The spring of 1817 found Miss Elsa Mackenzie in her third London season, though one could scarcely call her participation willing. At 21, she possessed the sort of delicate beauty that might have launched 1,000 courtships, hair the color of autumn fire, eyes green as the Highland hills she would never see again, and features so finely wrought they seemed almost ethereal. Yet there remained something profoundly unsettling in her stillness, a quality that made the matrons of Mayfair whisper behind their fans and the gentlemen keep a respectful, if curious, distance. She held her teacup with both hands, extracting what warmth she could from its depths, her gaze never resting upon any single point for longer than necessary. The habit betrayed a vigilance born of terror and constant surveillance of her surroundings, as though searching perpetually for the threat she had once failed to anticipate. Those who observed closely might have noted how she flinched at sudden sounds, how the parlor's door opening uninvited caused her shoulders to tense perceptibly. These were the small betrayals of a mind that had learned to expect catastrophe. She resided at Hartley Manor in Hampshire when not required in town, the guest of her distant cousins who had taken her in after the tragedy. The Hartleys were respectable gentry, their bloodline impeccable if not spectacular, their fortune comfortable if not ostentatious. Mr. George Hartley had inherited the estate from his father, along with the obligation to provide for any family members in need. And Miss Mackenzie, orphaned and penniless after the brutal suppression of her clan in the Scottish Highlands, certainly qualified as such. The household consisted of Mr. Hartley, a portly gentleman of 45, who preferred his library to society, his wife, the former Miss Dorothea Fensham, who had brought a modest dowry and 3 daughters to the marriage, and those daughters themselves, Henrietta, the eldest at 23, already considered dangerously close to spinsterhood, Beatrice, a lively creature of 19 with honey-colored curls, and Cecilia, the youngest at 17, still enjoying her first season with all the enthusiasm her older sisters had long since abandoned. Ilse occupied a peculiar position in this household. She was neither servant nor true family, neither guest nor burden. Or perhaps she was all of these things simultaneously, her status shifting with the convenience of the moment. Mrs. Hartley introduced her at social gatherings with a particular tone that managed to convey both Christian charity and subtle martyrdom. The implication hung in the air unspoken, but unmistakable. We have taken in this poor Scottish creature, you see, after those dreadful troubles in the north. Those dreadful troubles. That was how polite society referred to the massacre that had destroyed everything Ailsa had ever known or loved. 3 years had passed since she had hidden in the root cellar of her family's modest manor house, whilst soldiers, English soldiers, though no one at Hartley Manor seemed to recall this detail, had cut down her father, her mother, her 2 brothers, and nearly every soul in their small Highland community. The crime of her clan had been loyalty to a lost cause, the Jacobite dream that had died bloodily at Culloden decades earlier, but whose embers still smoldered in certain Highland hearts. Ailsa had been 18 when they came. She could still recall with perfect, terrible clarity the sound of her mother's voice commanding her to hide, the weight of the trapdoor closing above her head, the suffocating darkness of that earthen space where potatoes and turnips were stored for winter. She had pressed her hands over her ears, but nothing could block out the sounds that followed. Screams, gunfire, the crackle of flames, the triumphant shouts of men who believed they were serving their king by slaughtering women and children. She had emerged 2 days later, driven out by thirst and the terrible silence. What she had found would have broken a stronger soul entirely. The manor was ash. The village was ash. The people, her people, were ash and blood and scattered bone. She had walked through the ruins in her soiled gown, stepping over bodies she recognized, unable to weep, unable to scream, unable to feel anything at all beyond a numbness so profound it seemed to extend into infinity. She remembered Elspeth McTavish, the blacksmith's daughter, who had given her a small wildflower that morning, a yellow bloom the color of sunshine. Elspeth had been 5 years old, with a gap-toothed smile and the kind heart peculiar to children who had not yet learned cruelty. That image, that child's face bright with innocent joy, haunted Ailsa most of all. She had later learned that Elspeth had been among those whom the soldiers had herded into the kirk before barricading the doors and setting the ancient stone alight, a terrible contradiction of the building's holy purpose. The memory of that small hand pressing the flower into hers became entwined with the knowledge of Elspeth's final moments, and the weight of that contradiction never entirely left her. A passing merchant had found her, and recognizing the remnants of gentility in her bearing, despite her condition, had delivered her to the nearest English garrison. From there, through a series of inquiries into her lineage, they had discovered her mother's connection to the Hartley family, distant, nearly forgotten, but sufficient to establish obligation. Mr. Hartley, a fundamentally decent man despite his preference for solitude, had accepted responsibility without complaint. His wife had been less gracious, though she maintained the appearance of Christian forbearance. For 3 years, Ailsa had lived among the Hartleys, wearing their cast-off gowns altered to fit her smaller frame, attending social functions at their insistence, and enduring the peculiar torture of being displayed as both charity case and curiosity. The Tun found her Scottish accent charming in small doses, her tragic history romantic in the abstract, and her continued unmarried state increasingly inconvenient as each season passed without a betrothal. She had refused 7 proposals of marriage. 7 gentlemen of varying ranks and fortunes had offered their hands, and 7 times she had declined with perfect politeness and absolute finality. The gentlemen themselves had ranged from elderly widowers seeking a decorative nurse to younger sons seeking any bride with acceptable bloodlines, regardless of fortune. Not one had seen her, truly seen her, beyond the exotic tragedy she represented. Mrs. Hartley had been increasingly vocal in her displeasure with each refusal. The household's duty was to see the girl settled, not to provide indefinite hospitality to an ungrateful relation who seemed determined to remain a burden. Mr. Hartley, in his quiet way, had defended Ailsa's right to refuse unsuitable matches, but even his patience was not infinite. There were his own daughters to consider after all, and Henrietta's prospects were not improved by residing in a household with a more beautiful, more interesting cousin, however impoverished that cousin might be. Henrietta herself had developed a particular bitterness regarding Ailsa's presence. At 23, having endured 4 seasons without receiving a single proposal, she watched her younger cousin refuse offers with increasing resentment. The injustice of it consumed her, that this Scottish refugee, this girl with no fortune, no connections, no prospects beyond charity, should be courted whilst Henrietta herself, legitimate daughter of a respectable family with a modest but adequate dowry, should be overlooked. The tension in the household had been building like pressure behind a dam, each refused proposal adding another crack to the structure. Beatrice and Cecilia, younger and less affected by the matrimonial urgency that plagued their elder sister, felt sympathy for Ailsa that they dared not express openly. They had noticed things their mother and sister had not: the nightmares that left Ailsa hollow-eyed at breakfast, the way she flinched at sudden noises, the manner in which her hands trembled when anyone spoke harshly in her presence. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday evening in late March, during what should have been a pleasant family dinner. Mr. Reginald Vaughan, a gentleman of respectable family and comfortable fortune, had called that afternoon to formally request Ailsa's hand in marriage. He was neither young nor old, neither handsome nor ugly, neither brilliant nor dull, a perfectly acceptable match by any objective measure, and far better than a penniless Scottish orphan had any right to expect. Ailsa had refused him. Mrs. Hartley had maintained icy silence throughout dinner, her displeasure evident in every precise movement of her cutlery. Mr. Hartley had attempted conversation about his latest agricultural experiments, to which no one responded. Beatrice and Cecilia had exchanged worried glances across the table. Henrietta had stared at her plate with the rigid posture of someone exercising superhuman restraint, her knuckles white where her hands gripped the edge of the table. The explosion, when it came, was spectacular. Henrietta's fork clattered against her plate with enough force to chip the porcelain. Her face had gone scarlet, and when she spoke, 3 years of accumulated resentment poured forth in a torrent that shocked even her mother into silence. She called Ailsa ungrateful, selfish, and manipulative. She accused her of enjoying her tragic status, of trading upon sympathy whilst refusing to fulfill the basic obligation of any gentlewoman, to marry respectably and cease being a burden upon her relations. She suggested that Ailsa's refusals stemmed from an inflated sense of her own worth, a delusion that her beauty and tragic history entitled her to something more than she deserved. She implied that Ailsa was performing grief rather than experiencing it, dramatizing trauma that had occurred 3 years past and should by now be decently laid to rest. The words were cruel, but they reflected a sentiment that had been growing in polite society, that Miss Mackenzie's continued mourning and unmarried state indicated a failure of character rather than depth of feeling. Widows were expected to mourn for a year and then rejoin society. Surely an orphan could not claim greater privilege of grief than a wife who had lost her husband. For several long moments after Henrietta's outburst concluded, silence reigned in the dining room. Mrs. Hartley looked torn between approval of the sentiment and horror at the breach of decorum. Mr. Hartley had gone pale. Beatrice had tears in her eyes. Cecilia had reached under the table to grasp her cousin's hand. And Ailsa, who had sat through the entire tirade with downcast eyes and trembling shoulders, finally lifted her head and spoke. What emerged from her lips was not defense or apology, but truth, raw, brutal, unvarnished truth that she had locked away for 3 years, unable to speak of it, unable to bear the weight of others knowing. Her voice was steady despite the tears streaming down her face, and her accent grew thicker as Highland vowels reclaimed their rightful place in her speech. She described that day, not in the sanitized version she had given the garrison commander, not in the brief summary that had sufficed for the Hartleys' initial understanding, but in terrible, complete detail. She told them about hiding in the darkness whilst her father was run through with a sword in his own doorway. She recounted hearing her mother beg for the lives of her sons, aged 15 and 12, and the laughter of the soldiers before the screaming stopped. She spoke of emerging to find her younger brother's body in the garden, of recognizing her father's signet ring on a hand that was no longer attached to an arm, of discovering that the soldiers had barricaded the kirk with every elderly person and small child of the clan inside before setting it alight. She described the children she had known, the futures they would never have, and most particularly, a small child named Elspeth, who had given her a wildflower on the last morning of her life. She told them about the smell, burning flesh and timber mixed with spring flowers, because it had been April and the Highland meadows had been in bloom. She described the sounds she still heard in nightmares, not just screams, but the specific timbre of her mother's voice, the way her older brother had called her name in those final moments, probably hoping she would remain hidden. She confessed to the guilt that consumed her, the knowledge that she lived whilst they died, that she had remained silent and safe whilst her family was butchered above her head. She explained with devastating simplicity that she could not bear to love again because everyone she had ever loved had been torn from her in blood and fire. That marriage meant vulnerability, attachment, the possibility of building a life with another person, and the certain knowledge that such happiness could be destroyed in an afternoon by violence and hatred, and the arbitrary cruelty of men who believed themselves righteous. That refusing proposals was not manipulation or pride, but the desperate act of someone trying to protect herself from the only thing worse than her current existence, caring deeply enough about another human being to be destroyed entirely when they inevitably were taken from her. By the time she finished speaking, Mrs. Hartley was weeping into her napkin. Mr. Hartley had covered his face with his hands. Beatrice had risen from her chair to stand behind Ailsa, hands on her cousin's shoulders in mute support. Cecilia was sobbing openly, and Henrietta, who had unleashed this torrent, sat frozen in her chair, her face a mask of horror and shame as she truly comprehended, for the first time, the depth of trauma her cousin carried. That night, Mrs. Hartley sat alone in her private chamber and confronted the uncomfortable truth of her own failure. She had known, in some distant, unacknowledged corner of her conscience, that her charitable tolerance masked a fundamental lack of compassion. She had accepted Ailsa out of duty, but had never truly seen her. She had been too preoccupied with her own daughter's futures, too invested in maintaining respectable appearances, too unwilling to contemplate the reality behind those haunted green eyes. Now, with the weight of Ailsa's testimony pressing upon her conscience, she could no longer maintain that comfortable ignorance. She resolved, in the privacy of that chamber, that something must change, not merely in how the household treated Ailsa, but in how she herself understood the nature of human suffering. The transformation in the household that followed was neither instantaneous nor effortless, but rather a gradual unwinding of old patterns and the cautious construction of new ones. Henrietta, overcome with remorse, had gone to Ailsa's chamber that very night to beg forgiveness with tears of genuine contrition. She had been ignorant, she confessed, willfully blind to suffering, because acknowledging it would have complicated her own grievances. She had resented Elsa for the attention her tragedy attracted, whilst failing to imagine what it meant to live inside that tragedy every moment of every day. Mrs. Hartley, in the days following the revelation, gradually relinquished her martyr's air. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. She cancelled the round of social engagements that had been scheduled for the following fortnight, declaring privately to her husband that the family required respite. When they did return to society, her introductions of Miss Mackenzie carried a new quality, not forced affection, but genuine warmth that grew more authentic with each passing week. She began attending Ailsa's side at social functions not as a duty, but as a willing companion. And when a neighbor remarked snidely about the refugee's continued presence, Mrs. Hartley responded with such withering civility that the woman never dared repeat the comment. Mr. Hartley, who had always been kind but distant, began seeking Ailsa's company in the library. He discovered that she possessed considerable intelligence, a love of poetry, and opinions on agricultural reform that rivaled his own. Their conversations became a regular feature of household life, and the respect he showed her thoughts did much to restore her sense of worth. More importantly, his quiet acceptance of her, asking nothing beyond her presence and her thoughts, provided a template for how one might care for another without demanding gratitude or immediate transformation. Beatrice and Cecilia, freed from the constraint of family tension, became Ailsa's true companions. They coaxed her out of the house for walks in the gardens, enlisted her help with their watercolors and needlework, and generally treated her as the beloved sister neither had possessed before her arrival. Their genuine affection, untainted by pity or obligation, proved remarkably healing. As spring deepened into early summer, something remarkable occurred. Ailsa began to emerge from the protective numbness she had cultivated for 3 years. The nightmares did not cease entirely, but they became less frequent and somewhat less vivid in their immediate aftermath. The constant vigilance that had exhausted her began to ease, though she remained alert in ways that suggested this particular wariness might be permanent. She discovered that she could laugh at Beatrice's wit without immediately feeling guilty for experiencing joy. She could admire the roses in the garden without being transported back to that April morning amongst the burning ruins of her home. She was not healed. Healing from such trauma might take a lifetime if it came at all, but she was no longer merely surviving. She was, tentatively and with great caution, beginning to live. It was in this fragile state of emergence that Providence, with its usual impeccable timing, introduced Lord Evan Montgomery into her life. Lord Evan Montgomery was not, strictly speaking, a lord in the sense that demanded particular deference. He was the third son of the Earl of Langley, which granted him the courtesy title but no inheritance beyond what his father chose to bestow. Fortunately, the Earl was both wealthy and generous, and Evan had received a substantial independence that allowed him to live comfortably without the desperate matrimonial urgency that afflicted many younger sons. At 8 and 20, he had spent the better part of the past 5 years traveling, ostensibly to study agricultural methods on the continent, but truthfully to escape the suffocating expectations of London society following his mother's death. The Countess of Langley had succumbed to a wasting illness when Evan was 3 and 20, and he had been present for every agonizing moment of her decline. The experience had marked him profoundly, instilling a deep understanding of grief and loss that set him apart from his peers, most of whom viewed death as an inconvenient interruption to their pleasures, rather than a fundamental reality of human existence. He had returned to England only a fortnight before his visit to Hartley Manor, drawn back by his father's increasingly urgent letters, suggesting that it was time for the youngest Montgomery son to consider his dynastic obligations. The Earl wanted grandchildren, and Evan's 2 older brothers had produced only daughters thus far. The family needed an heir, and if Evan would not provide one, the title and estates would pass to a distant cousin whom nobody liked. Evan had always known he would marry eventually. He simply had not expected to feel any particular enthusiasm about the prospect. Marriage, in his observation, was a practical arrangement undertaken for practical reasons: alliances, fortunes, heirs. Love, when it occurred at all, generally developed after the vows were spoken, as couples learned to rub along together comfortably. Those who entered marriage expecting passion and romance were inevitably disappointed. The Hartleys had been neighbors to an estate that Evan's mother had inherited from her family, a property that now belonged to Evan himself through her will. Mr. Hartley and the late Countess had maintained a correspondence on matters of agricultural interest, and Evan had written ahead to announce his intention to visit both his property and the Hartleys during his stay in Hampshire. Mr. Hartley had responded with enthusiasm, inviting him to dinner and overnight accommodation, as the neighboring estate's manor house had been closed for years and would require preparation before Evan could reside there comfortably. Evan arrived at Hartley Manor on a Thursday afternoon in early June, when the roses were in spectacular bloom and the countryside had achieved that particular lushness that makes England seem like paradise itself, provided one ignores the mud and the midges. He was received with the warmth due to the son of an earl, even if that son was merely the third of 3, and shown to a guest chamber that overlooked the gardens. It was from his window, whilst his valet unpacked his bags and muttered about the inferior quality of provincial laundry facilities, that Evan first saw Ailsa Mackenzie. She was walking in the garden with 2 younger women whom he correctly assumed were Hartley daughters. All 3 wore simple muslin gowns, appropriate for a warm afternoon in the country, their hair dressed informally. The 2 Hartley girls were animated, gesturing and laughing as they walked. The third woman moved with a peculiar restraint that caught his attention entirely. There was no artifice in her movements, no performance for an invisible audience, merely a woman moving through space with the careful precision of someone who had learned to occupy as little room as possible. She was beautiful. That was his first observation, and it was banal enough. England was full of beautiful women. What struck him more forcefully was the quality of her beauty, which seemed almost painful in its delicacy, as though something essential had been refined away, and only the most exquisite components remained. When she smiled at something one of her companions said, the expression transformed her face entirely, and he felt an unexpected tightness in his chest, a sensation he could not quite name. His valet coughed meaningfully, and Evan withdrew from the window, somewhat embarrassed to have been caught staring like a schoolboy at his first assembly. He dressed for dinner with more care than usual, which his valet noted with approval, and Evan refused to examine too closely. The evening meal was pleasant enough. Mrs. Hartley proved to be an accomplished hostess, steering conversation expertly to ensure all participants had opportunity to contribute. Mr. Hartley was every bit as intelligent and well-informed as his letters had suggested, though he exhibited the academic's tendency to digress into tangential subjects at unexpected moments. The daughters were charming. Miss Henrietta handsome in a severe way, Miss Beatrice vivacious and witty, Miss Cecilia still possessing that unformed sweetness of very young women who have not yet learned that the world might hurt them. And then there was Miss Mackenzie. She was introduced last, with a subtle emphasis that communicated both her position in the household and the family's protective stance toward her. Evan noted the Scottish surname and recalled vague rumors of Highland troubles, though he could not immediately place the specific circumstances. She curtsied with perfect grace, murmured something conventional about being pleased to make his acquaintance, and then said almost nothing else for the first 2 courses. Evan found himself watching her, discreetly, he hoped, though Miss Beatrice caught his eye at one point with a knowing smile that suggested his discretion was less successful than intended. There was something profoundly wrong, he thought, about a beautiful young woman who held herself with such careful stillness, as though she feared drawing attention, or as though she were made of glass and might shatter if someone spoke too loudly. It was during the fish course that he deliberately drew her into conversation, asking what she thought of a particular novel that Mr. Hartley had mentioned earlier. It was a small thing, a courtesy extended to a quiet dinner companion, but the look she gave him suggested that simple courtesies were not common in her experience. She responded thoughtfully, revealing both intelligence and a distinctly Scottish perspective on English literature that he found refreshingly honest. He coaxed further conversation from her as the meal progressed, careful to include the other ladies so as not to make his interest too particular, but returning repeatedly to Miss Mackenzie with questions and observations that invited her response. He watched the careful mask she wore begin to slip, revealing glimpses of wit, passion, and a kind of fierce intelligence that had clearly been concealed behind conventional pleasantries for far too long. After dinner, when the ladies withdrew and Mr. Hartley offered port, Evan learned the full history of his Scottish guest. Mr. Hartley, who had consumed slightly more wine than usual, spoke with unusual candor about the massacre, the aftermath, and the Hartley family's initial failure to comprehend the depth of damage such trauma inflicted. He described the recent revelation at dinner, his voice rough with emotion, as he confessed his shame at having been comfortably ignorant whilst his wife's relations suffered in silence under his own roof. Evan listened with growing horror, his mind conjuring images of that day in the Highlands. Images made more vivid by his own experience watching his mother die slowly, understanding that some griefs were too large to be contained by conventional mourning periods or polite sympathy. His mother's death had been expected, attended by doctors, eased by laudanum. She had died in her own bed with her family around her, and it had still nearly destroyed him. What Miss Mackenzie had endured was exponentially worse, unexpected, violent, total. No wonder she moved through the world like a ghost, present but not quite alive, participating in society whilst remaining fundamentally apart from it. When they rejoined the ladies in the drawing room, Evan saw Miss Mackenzie with new eyes. The delicacy he had observed was not ethereal femininity, but the brittleness of someone barely holding herself together. The silence he had noted was not shyness, but the self-protection of someone who had learned that speaking honestly about one's inner life brought judgment rather than understanding. The careful stillness was not grace, but the frozen immobility of prey, trying not to attract the predator's attention. Miss Cecilia had been prevailed upon to play the pianoforte, and she performed competently, if not brilliantly. Miss Beatrice sang a ballad in a clear soprano that drew genuine applause. Mrs. Hartley suggested that Miss Mackenzie might favor the company with a Scottish air, and Evan watched the woman flinch as though struck before composing herself and declining politely, pleading insufficient practice. The refusal had been accepted gracefully, but Evan noticed that Mrs. Hartley and her daughters exchanged glances that suggested this was a recent development, that Miss Mackenzie had previously avoided any display of her heritage, and the family was still learning how to navigate her relationship with her own identity. It was a delicate business, he thought, knowing when to encourage and when to retreat, and he gave the Hartleys credit for trying, even if they had taken 3 years to begin. The evening concluded at a respectable hour, and Evan retired to his chamber with his thoughts in unusual disarray. He could not recall the last time a woman had so thoroughly captured his attention, and he was honest enough to admit that the attraction was not purely physical. Though Miss Mackenzie was undeniably lovely, it was something else, some quality of contained sorrow, of carefully guarded strength, of survival purchased at terrible cost. He recognized in her something of what he had experienced after his mother's death, that sense of being fundamentally altered by grief, of inhabiting a world that looked the same but felt completely different, of being surrounded by people who could not possibly understand because they had not stood in the same dark place. Most people had never truly grieved, not in the way that changed one's entire comprehension of existence. Miss Mackenzie had grieved. More than that, she was still grieving, would probably always be grieving, because some losses were too enormous to be neatly resolved. He wanted, with sudden and surprising intensity, to know her better, to understand the woman behind the careful mask, to discover whether the glimpses of fire he had seen during dinner represented her true nature or merely brief flickers before the darkness reclaimed her. It was an inconvenient feeling, this attraction. He had returned to England intending to fulfill his duty by finding an appropriate wife, someone pleasant, well-born, capable of managing a household and producing heirs without drama or complication. Miss Mackenzie was many things, but uncomplicated was certainly not amongst them. She had no fortune, questionable connections, and enough emotional turmoil to daunt any sensible man. He should, by all reasonable standards, dismiss her from his thoughts and focus his attention on more suitable prospects. London was full of eligible women who would welcome the addresses of an earl's son, even a third son. He could have his choice of debutantes with impressive dowries and impeccable bloodlines, women who would bring alliances and advantages to a union. But Evan had spent 5 years traveling the continent, had stood in ancient ruins and magnificent cathedrals, had seen artwork that moved him to tears and landscapes that stole his breath. He had learned that the most valuable things in life were rarely the most convenient, and that settling for comfort over connection was a particular kind of death of the soul. He fell asleep thinking of green eyes and red hair, of a voice that carried the music of the Highlands, of a woman who had survived the unsurvivable and somehow retained the capacity for wit and intelligence despite her scars. If this was foolishness, he thought drowsily, it was at least interesting foolishness. And life, he had learned through hard experience, was too short and too uncertain to spend it being entirely sensible. Bosca Act 3. The Slow Unfurling of Hearts. Evan's visit to Hartley Manor was originally intended to last 3 days, whilst his own estate was being prepared for habitation. Those 3 days extended to 5, and then to 7, as various convenient excuses arose for prolonging his stay. The Hartleys, genuinely enjoying his company and perhaps recognizing a quality in him that suggested safety for their fragile Scottish relation, raised no objection to his continued presence. He was not, in fact, pursuing Miss Mackenzie. At least, he told himself he was not pursuing her in any deliberate sense. He was simply present, available, strategically positioned to facilitate continued acquaintance. The household had fallen into pleasant routines. Mornings were spent in various productive activities. Mr. Hartley tended to his correspondence and estate business. Mrs. Hartley supervised household affairs, and the young ladies occupied themselves with needlework, reading, and music practice. Evan typically joined Mr. Hartley in the library, where they discussed agricultural innovations and debated the merits of various crop rotation schemes with the enthusiasm of men who found such subjects genuinely fascinating. Miss Mackenzie often worked on correspondence during these morning hours, writing letters to distant Mackenzie relations who had survived the Troubles and scattered across Scotland and the continent. Evan noticed that she wrote in Gaelic, the letters forming elegant shapes he could not decipher. Once, when she believed herself unobserved, he had watched her press a finished letter to her chest, eyes closed, lips moving in what might have been prayer, or simply the voicing of words too painful to speak aloud. Afternoons brought social activities. The Hartley sisters had adopted the habit of walking in the gardens, and Evan began joining these excursions with a casualness that fooled absolutely no one except possibly himself. Miss Beatrice, who possessed considerable perceptiveness beneath her cheerful demeanor, took it upon herself to ensure that Evan and Miss Mackenzie often found themselves walking together, falling slightly behind the main group in conversations that began with safe topics and gradually deepened into something more substantial. It was during these walks that Evan began to truly know Ailsa Mackenzie, not the silent dinner companion or the tragic figure of rumor, but the intelligent, thoughtful woman who existed beneath the protective barriers she had constructed. She spoke of Scotland with fierce love, describing landscapes he had never seen in words that made him wish to visit immediately. She revealed a thorough education, unusual for a Highland girl, but explained by her father's conviction that daughters deserved intellectual cultivation as much as sons. She asked questions about his travels and seemed genuinely interested in his responses rather than merely being polite. She had opinions, strong ones, about agriculture, politics, literature, and art. She was not always agreeable, which he found refreshing after years of encountering women who had been trained to reflect back whatever opinions their male companions expressed. She challenged his assumptions, disputed his conclusions, and occasionally made observations that forced him to reconsider positions he had thought settled. He told her about his mother, not the sanitized version he offered in polite company, but the truth, the months of watching her waste away, the helpless rage of being unable to prevent her suffering, the peculiar guilt of wishing for her death simply to end the agony. He described the aftermath, the numbness that had driven him to flee England rather than face his grief directly, and the slow recognition that traveling was not healing, but merely postponing the necessary work of learning to live with loss. She listened without interruption, her green eyes intent on his face, and when he finished, she said something that no one else had ever said. "You did not abandon her by leaving. You honored her by surviving. She would not have wanted you to sacrifice your life to mourning hers." The words broke something open in him, some knot of guilt he had not fully acknowledged until that moment. He had always suspected, in some deep place he avoided examining, that his travels were a form of cowardice, running from grief rather than facing it. But Miss Mackenzie, who understood the weight of survivor's guilt better than anyone he had ever met, was telling him that survival was not betrayal, that living, even whilst mourning, was itself a form of tribute to those who no longer could. They spoke of many things during those afternoon walks, but they did not speak of the future or of feelings developing between them. That would have been premature, perhaps even impossible given Miss Mackenzie's stated determination never to allow herself to care deeply again. Instead, they existed in a careful present, each day a gift that demanded no promises or commitments beyond the moment itself. Evan was not so naive as to miss the signs of his own growing attachment. He thought of her upon waking and before sleeping. He found himself considering her preferences when Mr. Hartley offered wine at dinner. He noticed when she looked tired, when she seemed particularly withdrawn, when something sparked genuine pleasure in her eyes. He wanted to know everything about her, not merely the facts of her history, but the texture of her thoughts, the architecture of her inner world. What he could not determine was whether she felt anything similar. She was kind to him, but she was kind to everyone. She engaged in conversation, but she conversed with Mr. Hartley and her cousins as well. She smiled at his wit, but she smiled at Miss Beatrice's jests too. The only distinction he could detect was a certain quality of attention she gave him, a focus that suggested she found him interesting perhaps, but interesting was not the same as attracted, and attraction was not the same as willing to consider the possibility of attachment. Yet occasionally he caught her watching him when she believed herself unobserved. The expression on her face was difficult to name, not quite fearful, but watchful in a way that suggested she was assessing something, testing the reliability of what she perceived. Miss Beatrice, during a moment when they found themselves briefly alone whilst Miss Mackenzie admired a particularly fine rose, offered unsolicited insight. "She cares for you," she said, with the directness of youth. "But she is terrified. You must be patient. She has been hurt beyond what most people can imagine, and she will not risk that hurt again unless she is absolutely certain of safety. And perhaps not even then." Evan had assured her that he understood, that he had no intention of rushing or pressuring Miss Mackenzie, that he was content to simply enjoy her company without expectations. This was only partially true. He did understand, and he would not rush her, but he was far from content. He wanted more than pleasant conversations and measured interactions. He wanted her trust, her affection, her heart. He wanted to be the person she turned to when nightmares came. He wanted to protect her from every unkindness the world might inflict. He wanted, God help him, to marry her and spend the rest of his life learning the infinite variations of her smiles. This was inconvenient, but undeniable. Evan Montgomery, who had spent 8 and 20 years being entirely sensible about matters of the heart, had apparently fallen completely and irrevocably in love with a Scottish orphan who had explicitly sworn never to love again. The crisis came during his 11th day at Hartley Manor. His estate was ready for occupation, and he could no longer reasonably delay his departure without causing speculation. The polite fiction that he was merely being neighborly had worn thin, and even Mr. Hartley, who was not particularly observant of social nuances, had begun making remarks about the pleasure of having Evan close enough for regular visits once he was established in his own house. Evan should have been planning his removal. Instead, he found himself in the library after breakfast, ostensibly reviewing agricultural reports, but actually staring into space and considering whether it was too soon to declare himself. By any reasonable standard, it was far too soon. He had known her less than a fortnight. She had given him no encouragement beyond pleasant conversation. Proposing marriage to a woman who had refused 7 previous offers would be presumptuous at best, cruel at worst. But there was a quality to their interactions that felt significant, a depth of understanding that could not be explained by the mere passage of time. He had shared things with her that he had told no one else. She had revealed aspects of her grief that she clearly did not speak of freely. There was trust between them, nascent but real. Miss Mackenzie entered the library whilst he was thus engaged in unproductive contemplation. She carried a book she wished to return to its proper shelf and seemed startled to find him there. They spoke briefly about the volume, a collection of Scottish poetry that Mr. Hartley had acquired specifically for her use, and Evan found himself asking if she would teach him some Gaelic words. The request clearly surprised her. She studied his face as though searching for mockery or condescension, but apparently finding neither, she agreed. They spent the next hour in language lessons, Evan proving himself a poor but enthusiastic student, stumbling over pronunciations that came naturally to her Highland tongue. She laughed at his attempts, genuinely laughed, without the careful restraint she usually maintained, and the sound was so unutterably lovely that he nearly abandoned all pretense of sensibility and kissed her right there amongst the bookshelves. He did not, of course. That would have been disastrous. But the temptation was strong enough to convince him that remaining at Hartley Manor much longer would test his restraint beyond endurance. He needed distance, perspective, time to think clearly about whether his feelings were genuine or merely the product of proximity and her undeniable appeal. That afternoon, he announced his intention to depart the following morning for his own estate. The Hartleys expressed appropriate regret and extracted promises of frequent visits. Miss Mackenzie said nothing at all, though something flickered in her eyes. Disappointment, perhaps, or relief. He could not tell. That evening, their final dinner together was pleasant but subdued. Evan drank more wine than was wise and spoke less than usual. Miss Mackenzie was particularly quiet, responding to direct questions but initiating no conversation. The Hartley daughters maintained cheerful chatter that felt slightly forced. Mrs. Hartley appeared thoughtful. Mr. Hartley, oblivious to undercurrents, discussed crop yields with undiminished enthusiasm. After the meal, when the gentlemen did not linger long over port, Evan found himself on the terrace whilst the ladies remained in the drawing room. The June evening was warm and fragrant with roses. He stood looking out over the gardens, hands clasped behind his back, considering his next actions with the careful deliberation of a man who suspected he was about to do something foolish. He was not surprised when the terrace door opened and Miss Mackenzie emerged. She had stepped out for air, she said, though the drawing room had been perfectly comfortable. They stood together in silence for several minutes, the sort of companionable quiet that only exists between people who have moved beyond the necessity of constant conversation. Then she spoke, her voice low and carrying that Highland music he had come to love. She thanked him for his kindness during his stay, for treating her as an equal rather than an object of pity, for sharing his own grief in a way that had made her feel less alone in hers. She wished him well in his new household and hoped they might continue their friendship through the neighborly visits he had promised. Friendship. The word struck him like a physical blow, though he kept his expression neutral. Was that truly all she felt? Or was it all she would permit herself to feel? He wanted to ask, wanted to push, wanted to demand she acknowledge the connection between them that felt too profound to be mere friendship. But he had promised Miss Beatrice he would be patient, had promised himself he would not pressure her, and so he simply agreed that their friendship had been a gift he valued greatly. They returned inside shortly thereafter. The evening concluded. Farewells were spoken with promises of future meetings. Evan retired to his chamber and lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and feeling like the greatest fool in Christendom. He departed Hartley Manor the next morning, and if he looked back more than once as his carriage rolled down the drive, if he caught a glimpse of red hair at an upper window, if his chest felt inexplicably tight, well, these were private sufferings that no one need know about. Evan's estate, which he had inherited from his mother and which bore the name Rosefield for the extensive rose gardens the late Countess had cultivated, was everything a gentleman of comfortable fortune could desire. The manor house, though modest by aristocratic standards, was well proportioned and handsomely appointed. The grounds were extensive enough for dignity without being burdensome to maintain. The tenants were prosperous and the land productive. He should have been content. He was not. The promised neighborly visits materialized with greater frequency than even Mrs. Hartley had likely anticipated. Evan discovered numerous reasons to call at Hartley Manor: agricultural questions for Mr. Hartley, books to be borrowed or returned, invitations to small dinners that he issued, and they graciously accepted. The Hartleys, in turn, visited Rosefield to admire his mother's roses and offer suggestions for improvements to the house. Miss Mackenzie always accompanied these visits, though she participated quietly, observing more than speaking. Evan found himself constantly aware of her presence, adjusting his conversation and actions to include her, seeking her opinions even when they were not offered. If the rest of the household noticed his particular attention, they were too polite or too kind to remark upon it directly. The summer progressed through July and into August. Evan's attachment did not diminish with time or familiarity. If anything, it deepened. Every interaction revealed new facets of her character: her unexpected humor, her fierce loyalty to those she cared for, her surprising knowledge of subjects ladies were not generally encouraged to study. She had read more philosophy than most men of his acquaintance, could discuss political economy with genuine understanding, and possessed views on social reform that were both progressive and thoughtfully articulated. During a local soiree in mid-August, held at the residence of a prominent neighboring family, Evan witnessed the true extent of Miss Mackenzie's complexity. The evening had been pleasant enough until a gentleman of conservative temperament, one Sir Reginald Ashworth, a man of considerable pomposity and limited intellect, began expounding upon the proper role of women in society. He declared, with the certainty of absolute mediocrity, that women of delicate sensibility ought not to concern themselves with matters of politics or agriculture, as such subjects were unsuited to their fragile constitutions. Most of the ladies present had smiled indulgently and said nothing. Miss Mackenzie, however, had set down her glass with deliberate precision and responded with quiet but unmistakable steel. She observed that Sir Reginald appeared to possess sufficient delicate sensibility for 3 women combined, and that in her experience, the fragility of female constitutions was greatly exaggerated by those who preferred their companionship to be decorative rather than intellectual. She further suggested that a society which systematically prevented half its population from contributing their minds was not progressing but regressing, and that history would likely judge such willful stupidity most harshly. The room had gone quite silent. Sir Reginald had flushed scarlet, and Evan had watched as the other ladies present began to regard Miss Mackenzie with something approaching awe, recognizing in her a courage they themselves possessed but had been trained to conceal. When Sir Reginald attempted to recover his dignity by making a cutting remark about the impropriety of Scottish women discussing matters beyond their station, Evan had intervened with a coolness that suggested the future Earl of Langley found Sir Reginald's opinions profoundly uninteresting. He had moved to Miss Mackenzie's side immediately thereafter, ensuring that his support was public and unmistakable. Yet it was Henrietta who delivered the final blow to Sir Reginald's wounded dignity. Rising from her seat with the composed authority of a woman claiming her rightful place, she had addressed him with glacial civility. She observed that Sir Reginald's anxiety regarding female intellect was, in her assessment, born of fear. Fear that women might prove superior to him in rational discourse, a fear she suspected was not entirely unfounded. She suggested, with devastating courtesy, that a gentleman truly secure in his position would welcome rather than suppress the intellectual contributions of the fairer sex. The room had erupted in suppressed laughter, and Sir Reginald had excused himself from the gathering shortly thereafter. The gesture had not escaped notice. Henrietta's public defense of her cousin marked a transformation in how society perceived their relationship. By the following week, it was whispered throughout the drawing rooms of Hampshire that Lord Evan Montgomery appeared to be courting the Scottish orphan with considerable seriousness, and that the entire Hartley family stood united in their support of the match. However, between these visits and the public displays of support, there existed a private struggle that only Evan and Miss Mackenzie fully understood. As his feelings deepened, so did his frustration at the limitations society imposed upon the expression of those feelings. He could call upon her, could arrange meetings, could demonstrate his regard through consistent presence and increasingly deliberate attention. But he could not touch her hand without strict propriety being observed. He could not express the depth of his feelings without risking her withdrawal entirely. He could not ask her to marry him without first being absolutely certain she would not refuse him and retreat into the protective shell she had constructed. One afternoon in late August, during a particularly heated discussion about the prospects for agricultural improvement in the coming season, his carefully maintained patience cracked. They had been walking alone, as much as 2 unmarried people could be alone, which was to say they were in the gardens with the Hartley sisters, trailing behind at a discretionary distance. Miss Mackenzie had disagreed with his assessment of a particular crop rotation method, offering instead a suggestion based on Highland farming practices that, upon reflection, he recognized was superior to his own thinking. He had told her so, and for a moment their eyes had met, and he had seen something in hers that resembled affection, or perhaps longing. In that instant, a flash of frustration overcame him. Frustration at the careful, measured pace they maintained, at the constant restraint, at the knowledge that she might never allow him to be more than a friend, however much he wished otherwise. He had asked, without preamble or careful phrasing, whether she truly believed it was possible for them to ever have anything beyond friendship. Whether the barriers she had constructed were insurmountable, or whether she might, someday, consider the possibility of something more. She had stopped walking. Her face had gone pale, then flushed, and for a terrible moment he thought she would refuse him outright, would withdraw her friendship along with any hope of future connection. Instead, she had taken several steps away from him and asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, whether he was asking her to marry him. He had clarified that he was not yet, not without her permission first, not without absolute certainty that she would welcome such a question. He was merely asking whether she thought such a thing might ever be possible, whether the future might hold different possibilities than the present. She had been silent for so long that he began to regret his impulsive honesty. Then she had told him, her Highland accent thickening as emotion overtook careful elocution, that she did not know, that the thought of loving anyone so deeply terrified her in ways she could barely articulate. That every time she felt her defenses beginning to crack around him, she retreated in panic because the possibility of loss seemed even more terrible now than it had 3 years ago, when loss was merely historical fact rather than potential future catastrophe. But she had also said something else, something that gave him fragile hope, that she was beginning, despite her terror, to believe that he was not asking her to choose between safety and happiness, but rather offering her the possibility of finding safety within happiness. That the very fact that he had not pressed her, that he had respected her, stated determination to remain unmarried, that he had simply remained present and patient and genuinely caring, had begun to suggest to her that perhaps love need not always end in fire and blood. She had asked for time, not an indefinite postponement, but genuine time to continue learning who she was when she was not afraid, to discover whether her capacity for happiness could grow to match her capacity for grief. Evan had agreed, though the waiting had nearly driven him to distraction. Every smile she gave him felt like a victory. Every conversation felt like progress towards some distant resolution he could not yet see. He began to spend his evenings at Rosefield, composing and decomposing letters he would never send, attempting to express feelings that seemed too large for words. Then, in late September, news arrived that would alter everything. News reached Hampshire of renewed tensions in Scotland, not a full rebellion, but skirmishes, arrests, rumors of planned uprisings that the Crown was suppressing with characteristic brutality. The reports were vague and contradictory, but they were enough to send Miss Mackenzie into a state of barely controlled panic. Evan learned of the situation from Mr. Hartley, who sent an urgent note requesting he come immediately. He arrived to find the household in disarray. Mrs. Hartley was attempting to maintain calm whilst clearly distressed herself. The daughters were frightened by their cousin's reaction. And Miss Mackenzie was in her chamber, having collapsed upon hearing the news, overwhelmed by memories and terror that her few surviving distant relations might be caught up in the violence. Evan did what any sensible gentleman would do. He immediately began making inquiries. He wrote to contacts in Edinburgh, to his father who had connections throughout Scotland, to anyone who might provide reliable information about what was actually occurring in the Highlands. He dispatched these letters with instructions for urgent delivery, sparing no expense for speed. Then he went to Miss Mackenzie's chamber. Propriety be damned, she needed someone who understood, and he was perhaps the only person available who truly did. Mrs. Hartley, after a moment's hesitation, permitted him to enter, though she remained in the room as chaperone, positioned discreetly by the window. Miss Mackenzie sat in a chair by the cold fireplace, staring at nothing, her face pale and her hands trembling. She looked as she must have looked 3 years ago, freshly traumatized and unable to process the horror she had witnessed. Evan knelt beside her chair, taking her cold hands in his, and spoke quietly. He told her that he had sent for information, that they would learn the truth soon, that rumors were often worse than reality. He reminded her that she was safe here, that she was protected, that whatever was happening in Scotland could not reach her in Hampshire. He promised that if any of her relations were in danger, he would personally ensure their rescue and safety, that he had resources and connections sufficient to protect those she loved. And then, because Miss Beatrice's advice was fresh in his mind and the moment seemed to demand absolute honesty, he told her that he loved her. Not in the formal phrases of a proposal, but simply, directly, without expectations. He said that he had tried not to love her, recognizing that she neither wanted nor welcomed such feelings, but that he had failed utterly. He loved her courage, her intelligence, her fierce heart that continued to beat despite the battering it had endured. He loved her compassion for others even when she could not extend such compassion to herself. He loved her Highland fire and her careful gentleness and the way she saw the world with eyes that understood both its beauty and its brutality. He told her that he wanted nothing from her, that she need not respond or reciprocate or feel any obligation whatsoever. He simply wanted her to know that she was loved, completely, unconditionally, permanently. That if she never felt able to return such feelings, he would still consider knowing her one of the great privileges of his life. That she was not alone, would never be alone again as long as he drew breath, because he would be there in whatever capacity she could tolerate, as friend or more, for as long as she would have him. She wept, not the careful, restrained tears she had shed during their previous conversations, but the wrenching sobs of someone whose defenses had finally collapsed entirely. He held her hands through it, anchoring her to the present, and when she finally quieted, he offered his handkerchief and remained kneeling beside her chair. She did not say she loved him. She did not accept or reject his implied offer of courtship. She simply whispered words in Gaelic whose meaning was clear in her tone. Gratitude for seeing her, for staying, for being willing to love someone as damaged and difficult as she knew herself to be. It was not a declaration of love, but it was not a refusal either. It was, perhaps, the beginning of permission to herself to feel what she felt, to consider the possibility that love might not inevitably lead to loss. Evan left her in her cousin's care and returned to Rosefield to await his inquiry's responses. They arrived over the next several days, and the news was considerably better than feared. The skirmishes were minor, contained to areas far from where Mackenzie relations resided. The arrests were few and largely theatrical, designed to frighten rather than punish. There was no massacre, no burning, no repetition of the horrors that had destroyed Miss Mackenzie's world 3 years previous. He delivered this news personally, watching the terrible tension drain from her face as he provided details. The relief was profound, but so was the recognition that had crystallized during those days of waiting. She could not continue living in fear of every rumor, every distant threat, every possibility of loss. This was not living. It was merely existing in a state of perpetual anticipatory grief. Something had shifted in Ailsa during those terrible days of uncertainty. When Evan visited several days after the crisis had passed, she sought him out in the garden where he was walking with Mr. Hartley, discussing new techniques for grafting roses. She interrupted their conversation, something she had never done before, and asked if Mr. Montgomery might spare a few minutes for private conversation. Mr. Hartley, no fool despite his occasional obliviousness, immediately excused himself. Evan followed Miss Mackenzie to a secluded corner of the garden where a stone bench sat beneath a trellis heavy with climbing roses. They sat together, careful propriety maintained, but there was a quality of intensity in her manner that suggested propriety was not her primary concern. She spoke haltingly at first, then with increasing fluency. She told him that she had been thinking about his words in her chamber, about her fear of loss, about the nature of love and grief. She had realized something during those days of terror about Scotland. Her attempt to protect herself from loss by refusing to love was futile. She already loved the Hartleys, her cousins especially. She already cared for her distant Mackenzie relations. She already valued her own life enough to fear its ending. The grief she sought to avoid was already present in potential form simply because she continued to exist in the world surrounded by people she cared for. Moreover, she had come to understand that her refusal to love again was not protecting her from pain, but denying honor to those she had lost. Her parents had loved her enough to hide her, to die so that she might live. Her brothers had loved their clan enough to fight for it. To refuse to love in their memory was to suggest that love itself was the problem, that their deaths had proved loving foolish rather than brave. She did not believe that. She believed that love was the only thing worth dying for, precisely because it was the only thing worth living for. She paused, gathering courage for what came next. Then she told him that she thought she might be falling in love with him. Terrifying as that was, dangerous as it felt, she could not promise to be uncomplicated or easy. The nightmares would not disappear. The grief would not vanish. She would likely always carry the scars of what she had experienced, and those scars would affect any relationship she attempted to form. But if he truly meant what he had said, if he was willing to be patient with her fears and gentle with her pain, if he could accept that she might never be entirely healed, then she would like to try. To court properly, to see if what she felt might grow into something she could trust enough to act upon. She was not promising marriage or any particular outcome. She was simply saying yes to possibility, which was more than she had thought herself capable of since that terrible April day 3 years past. Evan, who had maintained admirable composure through considerable provocation, felt his eyes sting with unexpected emotion. He took her hand, improperly without gloves between them, and told her that whatever she could give, whenever she felt able to give it, would be enough. That he asked nothing except the privilege of her company and the hope that she might someday trust him with her heart. That her scars did not diminish her worth in his eyes, but rather proved her strength. That he would wait as long as necessary, and that even if she ultimately decided she could not marry him, he would count their courtship amongst his life's greatest blessings. They sat together on that bench until Miss Beatrice came to fetch them for tea, hands clasped between them, speaking occasionally, but mostly simply existing in shared space, two wounded souls tentatively reaching toward the possibility of healing. The courtship that followed was not the hurried affair of two uncomplicated young people, but rather the careful, intentional union of two individuals, learning to trust not only each other, but the possibility of their own futures. Ailsa began, tentatively, to participate more fully in the life of the household and the community. She allowed herself to laugh more readily. She permitted herself to speak her mind without the careful filtering that had characterized her previous interactions. Yet there remained moments when the trauma reasserted itself with unexpected force. In October, during a fitting for a new gown, the sharp bang of a stable door slamming outside caused her to flinch violently, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow, her eyes unseeing as her mind retreated to that day in the Highlands. The dressmaker and Mrs. Hartley looked alarmed, uncertain how to respond to such a reaction. But Evan, arriving to collect her for an afternoon engagement, found her in this state and responded with a wisdom born of genuine love. He did not attempt to reason her out of the panic or dismiss it as irrational. He did not offer empty reassurances that nothing would ever hurt her again. Instead, he simply sat beside her, speaking quietly about the specific details of the present moment. The color of the walls, the sound of servants' voices in the hallway, the taste of the water he pressed to her lips. He grounded her, not through grand gestures, but through patient, persistent presence, reminding her body and mind that she was safe, that she was here, that the danger had passed. When the panic had sufficiently subsided, he remained seated beside her in the drawing room, whilst Mrs. Hartley and the dressmaker discreetly withdrew. He held her hand and made no demands for explanation or gratitude. He simply existed beside her, suggesting through his presence that such moments did not diminish his regard for her, that they were simply part of the reality of her recovery, and that she was not alone in navigating them. It was this willingness to love not merely her joyful self, but also her wounded self, her panicked self, her broken self, that finally allowed Ailsa to believe in the possibility of a lasting union. She began, in late October, to imagine a future. Not without scars, or nightmares, or difficult moments, but a future nonetheless. A future with roses and libraries and someone who understood that survival itself was a form of courage. News of the engagement was announced in early November, and the reaction it provoked was mixed. In London drawing rooms, speculation ran the gamut from romantic enthusiasm to practical skepticism. The on dit suggested everything from a genuine love match to a calculated attempt by Lord Evan Montgomery to acquire a sympathetic and beautiful companion without the complications of a fortune. But those who knew both principles, who had witnessed the careful patience of his courtship and the gradual unfurling of her trust, recognized something more authentic in the union. The Earl of Langley himself arrived in Hampshire to render his own verdict. His appearance, unannounced and imposing, sent a ripple of anxiety through Hartley Manor. Ailsa, who had faced down soldiers and starvation, found herself inexplicably terrified of this stern-faced aristocrat who held her future in his hands. The Earl observed everything with an unreadable expression, his silence more unnerving than any vocal objection. He listened to his son's impassioned explanations, acknowledged Mr. Hartley's staunch defense of the match, and watched Ailsa move through her days with a quiet dignity that seemed unshakable. The true test, however, came not in the drawing room, but during a conversation the Earl orchestrated with Miss Mackenzie privately. He asked her directly whether she understood what she was accepting, not merely a comfortable life as a gentleman's wife, but potentially a future countess, with all the attendant responsibilities and public scrutiny such a position entailed. He asked whether her trauma, whilst sympathetically regarded by most of polite society, might not become a liability, a subject of gossip and speculation that would follow her and, by extension, his family. Ailsa had answered with the fierce clarity that had characterized her from the beginning. She said that she understood precisely what she was accepting, and that if the Earl believed she was incapable of managing the responsibilities of her position, she would withdraw her acceptance immediately rather than subject his family to the complications of a reluctant countess. She further stated that she would not apologize for her trauma, that she refused to accept shame for surviving circumstances beyond her control, and that if society wished to gossip, society was welcome to do so. She had learned long ago that the opinions of those who had never experienced genuine hardship were largely irrelevant. The Earl had regarded her in silence for some time. Then he had smiled. A genuine smile, the first warmth she had seen in his austere features. He told her that his son had not chosen a bride who would bring fortune or alliances to the family, but one who would bring something far more valuable: honor. Then, his expression softening further, he added something unexpected. "My late wife," he said quietly, "was also considered an inadequate choice by many in society. I see in you, Miss Mackenzie, the same indomitable spirit that she possessed. I would be a fool to stand in the way of a union of such caliber, and I will not repeat the mistakes of those who once doubted my own judgment in matters of the heart." His blessing had been given not merely with consent, but with profound respect born of personal understanding. With the Earl's approval secured, the Hartley family completed their own redemption. Mrs. Hartley, once a purveyor of martyred charity, now sang Ailsa's praises with the fierce pride of a true mother. Henrietta, in a public act of atonement, silenced a cruel whisper about Ailsa's origins at a local assembly with a look so glacial it could have frozen the Thames in July. She had become, surprisingly, Ailsa's most fervent defender, her transformation born not merely of guilt, but of genuine affection and admiration. Their support was no longer born of duty or guilt, but of love. The wedding was set for the last week of November, a time when the Hampshire countryside was draped in mist and the fires burned brightly in the hearths. The ceremony was to be a reflection of the union it celebrated, a careful weaving of two cultures. In the weeks prior, Ailsa worked with Beatrice and Cecilia, not on a traditional bridal veil, but on a sash of tartan. It was the pattern of her clan, the vibrant colors of red and green and blue that she had not seen since she was a girl. To touch it was to touch memory, but the pain was now tempered with a sense of continuity, of honor. Evan, meanwhile, spent his evenings with a Scottish priest brought from London, practicing the ancient words of loyalty and love in Gaelic, his determination a quiet testament to the depth of his commitment. On her wedding day, Ailsa walked down the aisle of the small parish church on Mr. Hartley's arm. She was a vision not of fragile English beauty, but of resilient Highland strength. Her gown was simple cream silk, but across it, from shoulder to waist, she wore the tartan of the Mackenzies. It was a declaration that she was not abandoning who she was, but bringing the whole of herself to this new life. When the time came for the vows, Evan turned to her, and in a clear voice that filled the silent church, he spoke the ancient Gaelic words of loyalty and love he had so painstakingly learned. A collective gasp rippled through the English guests, followed by a wave of profound understanding. Ailsa's eyes filled with tears as she gave her own vows in the king's English, her voice steady and sure. The reception held at Rosefield was intimate and joyful, filled with the warmth of family and true friends who had witnessed the careful unfolding of this remarkable love story. Later that evening, Ailsa stood with her husband at a window overlooking the moonlit gardens his mother had planted. She touched the tartan sash at her shoulder, its texture familiar and comforting. The ghosts of her past were not gone. They would always be part of her story. But they were no longer specters that haunted her every step. They were ancestors, watching with approval as she chose to honor their memory, not by retreating from the world, but by embracing it with all the courage and love she possessed. She had survived. She had endured. She had emerged on the far side of horror, still capable of compassion, still capable of feeling, still capable of the very thing she had sworn never to risk again: love. She had been the Highland rose they pitied, the fragile bloom transplanted into foreign soil, expected to wither. But she had not withered. Nourished by a love that was patient, true, and unafraid of her scars, she had finally, gloriously bloomed. And so, another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society.